All right, so now I want to talk to you about complexity. Complexity is easily the hardest point to earn, full credit-wise. And you'll see why as I go through it. So complexity is this idea that's going to cover three different areas. It covers your overall arguments, it covers your writing, and it covers your nuance. So your arguments, for you to get full credit on complexity, your analysis has to be fully correct. That's like a precursor. So before I even start grading, so it's not just like an individual point that you're getting for one thing, it's an overall paper point as well. Does that make sense? So your arguments, your analysis has to be correct. Your writing has to be good as well, meaning grammar and word choice is strong throughout. So let's say you have nuance, but your writing is just not very strong. You still probably will not get full credit for complexity. It's a whole paper point and an individual point all in one. And I'm going to explain where those two differences lie. But the last part is that you have nuance, which means you are able to provide multiple viewpoints to your argument, and you're able to explain that through a counterclaim. So I'm first going to explain the getting half credit on complexity, because that's what most of you are probably, if you get the complexity point. I think last year I had 2 or 3 papers through the entire semester that got the full complexity point. And the reason why it's very, very difficult to achieve. So that's why I create a halfway measure though, so that you can still earn a 95 fairly easy. So this is where you would just include a counterclaim in your argument. Now counterclaims are going to follow what the paper is asking you to do. If the paper is asking you to talk about causes, then you're going to talk about effects as well. If it's asking about similarities, you're going to also talk about differences. If it's asking about what changed, then you're going to talk about what stayed the same. So the question that's being asked is, how did the market revolution change American society? So because of that, your counterclaim would follow somewhere along the lines of, well, what stayed the same? What didn't change? And your counterclaim would look like this 3-part thesis that we've done before, which is, while the market revolution did affect American society in this way, blank, it did not affect it in blank and blank. All right. What you would then do is just how you have other argumentative buckets. You would have one argumentative bucket that shows how things stayed the same. If you were able to do that correctly, you would get half of the credit for complexity, which is 5 points. Complexity is worth 10 points overall. All right. Now, the 10-point complexity point is where you still have this counterclaim present, but the nuance and complexity is not located just there. It's located throughout the entire paper. So to give you just a number, because I think for students it's helpful to give a number, it would mean that your argument consistently has nuance, so there's at least 2 additional points of this nuance. And again, what nuance is, it's where you're able to argue multiple viewpoints of how this did or did not shape society, or you could also debate about, is this positive or negative, and kind of highlighting those things. Let me give you just an example, because I'll just drop a little breadcrumb for you. There is a document about women in your paper. You could argue that that document supports the idea that society had a positive effect with this women entering into the workplace, or you could also argue that based off the information from the document that it wasn't necessarily positive for women due to the working conditions. All right, so let's go through just 2 examples using your first paper so you can kind of see the difference between the first one and the second one, getting half credit versus full credit. So I would say the Chesapeake and New England colonies became different due to the types of settlers that were in the colony and the purpose for why they arrived, although they did still both have violent tendencies towards Native Americans. So I argue that this is how they became different, but there is still some similarity here or some consequence that's still the same. Because again, when you're arguing causes, you could also look at effects. So, and then in my counterclaim, I would have talked about Powhatan, who is from the Chesapeake, and King Philip's War in New England, and I would have argued that basically the treatment of those Native Americans were the same exact way. For the 10-point, the thesis would be structured pretty similarly, although I would make my counterclaim a little more vague, which would have said, however, the negative traits that are seen in the Chesapeake colonies did exist in the New England colonies as well. And then I would hammer this point over and over and over again, that basically, like, the Chesapeake and New England colonies, are they that different? I'm almost challenging the question. The question's saying, how did they become different? And my paper is actually arguing, well, in a lot of ways, they're kind of the same. So examples that I might use to highlight this would be that Roger Williams did rebel against John Winthrop, not that different than Nathaniel Bacon rebelling against Governor Berkeley. The Salem witch trials did show like a bloodthirsty society, not that different than what we saw in John Smith's document. And while there is a lot of chaos in the southern colonies, they were able to establish governments like the House of Burgess, which New England was able to establish their own form of self-government as well. And then I would also still include the same counterclaim. The reason why the 10-point example is really difficult to go for is because you basically have to make your entire paper much more argumentative and complex to get the point. You're going to have to challenge the prompt consistently, or challenge your notions of what's right versus what's wrong, and create much more of a gray paper. For some students, that's exciting. You enjoy kind of muddying the waters a little bit. For other students, this seems super stressful, and if that seems super stressful, it's okay. Like this 5-point example is fine, go for that one. Write the paper how you would normally write it, and have one counterclaim. The counterclaim can be outside information, or a lot of times there are documents out there that support counterclaims. So either one would be fine.